Okay, welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to do the second video in our course on inequality and the economy. This one is called What is Wealth Inequality? And if we get time, we'll go on to how it affects the economy. This is really the heart of my economic understanding. It's what I made my money on, and it's really important for all of our videos. So hope you enjoy it. All right, so second video. First video was what is wealth? And that was just explaining that we're not talking about jobs, we're not talking about income. Wealth is about assets, physical assets. Who owns the assets? So in this country, it's largely property, not just housing, but also commercial property, offices, shops, restaurants, bars, factories, natural resources like the farmland, the power plants, so the generation of essentials like food and energy. Who owns those things? And also debt. So some people owe debt to other people. That is wealth. Not about jobs, it's about who owns the wealth. And this video is going to be about what is wealth inequality. So when we talk about wealth inequality, it's about who owns those things. I think the best way to explain this is through imagining two separate kinds of economies. One which is relatively wealth equal, so where all of that wealth is like quite evenly distributed throughout society, and one which is very unequal. So where all of that wealth is owned by, a small handful of families. So in the wealth equal economy, basically everyone's going to own like a big chunk of the house they live in. Everyone will pretty much own the house they live in, but they're also going to own a lot of the productive capacity in society. So the way we see that nowadays is basically everybody has like a big stock portfolio. So everybody owns their own house or a chunk of their house, and they also have like a stock portfolio, which means they own some of the corporations. Through those stocks, they're going to own, some of the commercial property, some of the buildings, some of the skyscrapers. They'll also own a chunk of the natural resources. So they'll own a little bit of the farmland. They'll own some of the power production. That's a wealth equal economy. Everybody owns, not everybody's going to own the same stuff, but everybody's got like a decent chunk of the wealth that exists in the country. That's the wealth equal economy. Now the wealth unequal economy, this is where basically everything is owned by like a small elite. It could be 1,000 people, it could be 1 million people, 1% of the country. They own everything, basically. So in that economy, ordinary people don't own anything. They don't have a stock portfolio. They don't own their own house, so they're likely to be renting, or they're likely to be owning with a big mortgage. And everything is owned by this small elite, basically. When you have this situation, then what you get is like significant transfer payments. So when you had the equal economy, there's not really a lot of transfer payments. Or if there are, they sort of go around because, okay, maybe you own the shops that I shop in, but maybe I own the farm where your food comes from. It ends up kind of balancing out. We all have a bit of passive income. There's no significant like transfer payments. But once you have a very unequal economy, you have these big transfer payments. So let's assume like I'm the sort of rich elite and you're just like a regular person. One thing to recognize straight away is the amount of wealth owned by the wealth owners per person is much, much, much higher in the unequal economy, because all of the wealth exists, but now like it's only distributed between like 1,000 people as opposed to like, this country, 60 million people. So I own everything, and you're paying me rent for your house. You're paying me for the food that you eat. You're paying me for the energy that you consume. Every time you go shopping, you're paying me to go to the shops. Every time you go to the pub, because I own the pub, I own the shop, I own the airport, I own the hospital, I own the school. So every time you're constantly having to make this transfer payment to me. That's the wealth unequal economy. So what are the differences? The first obvious difference is, in a wealth equal economy, you've got a lot more financial security, and you've got a decent passive income. Obviously, if you had a decent chunk of the country's wealth, you could probably survive without working for a decent amount of time. Right? Firstly, because you've got this passive income, you've got this stock portfolio. Secondly, because you're not paying rent, you're not paying a mortgage because you own the property that you live in. So you've got quite a lot of financial security. You've got passive income. If you want to stop working for a bit, if you want to like pursue your hobbies, you can do that. Whereas in the wealth unequal economy, the ordinary person doesn't have any financial security, right? You don't have any savings you can run down. If you lose your job, you're not eating, basically. You're not paying the rent. So you're much more financially insecure. The The flip of that is that the rich have this massive, massive passive income that they've got every year, every month, every week, basically. What we should point out is like the real world is somewhere in between this. So there are some countries which are super, super, super unequal, you know. If you go to sort of some countries in Africa or Latin America or India, wealth is very, very unequal. And ordinary people don't own much. If they do own stuff, it's like sort of, they usually have debt behind it. But you know, this country we're in now it's like a middle point. So I'm not saying that this country is that super wealth unequal space. We'll talk about that later, but the real world is somewhere in between. Yeah, so that's what you have. In the unequal economy, you have these two groups. This very, very large group that has no real security. They have to work in order to live. They don't have much passive income. And you have this very small group that is extremely wealthy and has this massive passive income. And you know, depending on how much inequality you have, those groups can vary in size, basically. So when you have this large wealthless group, they're insecure, they don't have a lot of income. So basically, most of what they get is going to get spent on essentials. The flip side of that is when you have a very, very wealthy group, they're small, but their income is massive. You need to understand, it's important to understand the economy, the economics of inequality, the way that very, very wealthy people spend, which is basically that they save almost everything that they make. And this is not because wealthy people are like crazy, they're obsessed with saving. It's just simply because their passive income is so big. So, you know, I often use the example of Rishi Sunak, whose wealth, according to the Sunday Times, is 700 million. So he'll make like £1 million a week passive income. So it's not that he's obsessed with saving, but you know, if you have £1 million a week passive income, it's basically impossible to, maybe someone can manage it, but your average person is making £1 million a week passive income. You know, even to spend, for me, even to spend £10,000, I can't even imagine how you could spend £10,000 a week, but because their income is so high, they simply basically have no choice but to save the money. So in an unequal society, you have a big chunk of people, only essentials, small group of people, but with massive income, just saving. Whereas in the wealth equal society, because everyone is quite secure, they will tend to live what nowadays we consider kind of middle class lives, which is they'll spend money, they'll go on holiday, they'll go to restaurants, they'll go to bars. You know, if they want to reskill or pursue a hobby, they might take time out of work. They might take time out of work to take care of children or to raise children or to travel because they have this financial security, they have these assets they can sell, they have this passive income. So it's very different. There's these kind of three types of spending profiles, right? The poor spending profile, which is only essentials. The rich spending profile, which is almost exclusively saving, buying assets. And the middle saving profile, which is like a relaxed sort of modern middle class lifestyle. So the first big difference you have between a more equal society and an unequal society is that the unequal society as a whole cares less about spending and cares more about saving. And that is because if we consider only the passive income that comes from ownership, in an equal society, that's all going to middle class people. And middle class people, they tend to spend most of what they get over the course of their life. If they get more money, they'll tend to increase their spending, whatever, go on more holidays, buy a bigger house, this kind of thing. So if you're churning this passive income to middle class people, it's getting spent. If instead we take all of that income and we give it to this tiny elite group, of course they will spend a lot of money, but we can see from the spending profiles of the very rich, you know, if you give £1,000 to a middle class person, he'll probably spend 600. You give £1,000 to Rishi Sunak, you're not going to notice, right? He's not going to change his spending at all. So as we give more and more money to the very rich, basically societal spending starts to fall. They don't want to spend money. And what they're doing instead is, well, if we look at the behavior of the very, very rich is, they're just saving, which, you know, saving can mean a few different things. It can mean investing, or it can also mean buying existing assets, or it can mean making loans. So they're buying assets, they're lending money. If there are good investments around, they'll try to do investments as well. So now I think we can consider like what these two worlds look like. When you consider these two things paired together, number one, in the wealth unequal world, there's a lot of people who are very financially insecure because they don't have savings to fall back on. They don't own their own house. They don't own their own food or energy. They don't have any passive income. These people are very insecure. And they live in a world where all of the spending power is held by a very small group of people who don't spend a lot of money. Yeah, so they live in this world where they really, really, really need to work, but society doesn't really want to spend that much because the group of people with spending power is quite small, and those people tend to save like 98% of their income. So you can see straight away they're in a bad situation, right? Because you have a world, loads of people need to work, there's very few potential customers, and those people don't actually spend much, like as a proportion of their income. Add on top of that, these guys have a ton of wealth, right? And that wealth includes, in a high technology society, it includes a lot of like labor saving stuff. So these guys own factories, but high tech factories don't actually need a lot of workers, right? Increasingly, you know, we're moving towards an AI world where, you know, these guys, they've got really high tech factories that don't need a lot of workers. They'll have AI, which means you need even fewer workers. I think when you add these things together, you can basically see my conclusion, number one, which is unequal economies have very low wages. And that is because, well, first thing I'll say is I think if you look at the world, you know, I'm not saying this is the only factor that matters, but I think if you look at the world, you will see that very unequal economies have low wages, whereas more middle class economies, like Western Europe, like North America, like Japan, like Australia, have higher wages. But once you see this logic, I think you can understand why, right? Which is when you have a very unequal society, you have a huge group of people desperate to work for a tiny group of people who don't spend much money and don't need any workers because they've got all of this productive capital, productive technology. So that's number one, conclusion number one. You can put it up there if you want. Unequal economies have low wages. That's number one. So the second thing is, you know, the reason that wages are low is because, okay, there's a lot of desperate workers, but also because the money is being controlled by people who don't want to spend. What they're doing instead is saving. So, you know, there's this kind of argument, and you get this from sort of trickle-down economics, which is actually, this is good because you're giving the money to savers, and saving is good, right? Because if we save, then we're going to invest and then we're going to grow. The problem you get is when there's not a lot of end consumption demand, companies don't actually want to grow. They don't want to invest because there's not really a lot of customers. And what companies want, if they want to grow, is they want customers, right? So what do rich people do when they're in a world that they have all of this massive passive income that they're not spending, but there's not a lot of actual investment opportunities around? The answer is they buy assets. They buy assets. Then they will try to buy assets from the middle class, if there is a middle class, or they will try to buy assets from each other, basically. And what you have is, when you have this unequal economy, you're giving all of the consumption power to very, very rich people. Very rich people, percentage-wise, have a very low demand to consume and a massive demand to save. Basically, what these people want is assets. So the second thing you will see is increase in asset prices. Massive increase in asset prices, because you're giving all of the money to people who are just trying to buy assets. And there's not a lot of investment opportunities. So they're buying assets, they're buying assets, they're buying assets. So I think this makes sense, right? If you take the consumption power away from ordinary people who spend, you give it to rich people who save, wages will fall and asset prices will increase. So these are, for me, these really are the two key features of an unequal economy. Low wages, high asset prices. But you can probably see instinctively that these two things like interrelate in quite a problematic way, right? Because if wages are low and asset prices, like including house prices, are high, and this includes like other like basic essentials of life, like, you know, like the farms which produce food, or, you know, the power plants which produce energy. These are assets as well. These will be expensive. What you have is a world where ordinary people have no wages, and the things which they need housing, food, energy are really expensive. So this is kind of like a really bad combination, basically. So what you see there is basically really high levels of financial insecurity, because not only are you desperate for work and it's hard to get a job, but the things which you need, the basic essentials of life, housing, food, energy, the assets that produce those things, including houses, are super, super, super expensive. So you have financial instability, but also you have this, it becomes really, really difficult to climb up. Because if you live in a world where wages are low, housing is really expensive, even if you're able to get a higher than average wage, it becomes quite possible that you'll never be able to afford a house, basically. So there you have the next thing, which is basically low social mobility. Low social mobility. And also increasingly, work becomes like less important in a weird way. It is important in one way, because if you don't work, you will die, because you need to work to eat. But work ceases to, the idea that if I work harder, if I study harder, get a better job or get a house, becomes less and less realistic, because wages are falling, house prices are rising. You know, even if you get 2 or 3 or 4 times the average wage, it might be that something like a house is out of reach. So you get this kind of crystallization of the class system. It becomes impossible to work your way up. The next thing I want to talk about is how this leads to a kind of concentration, economic concentration in capitalism. So we're talking about a concentration of wealth, right? But this manifests in different ways, right? So we have really, once we concentrate wealth, we concentrate passive income, we also concentrate spending power. Suddenly then, if I'm a business and I want to grow, what am I going to do? Well, I'm not going to produce stuff that you want, because you've got no fucking money, right? You're saving up everything you can just to buy a house. You know, you can't afford to go to the pub, you can't afford to go to the restaurants. So your pub's going to close down. The restaurants in your area are going to close down, right? They're going to get turned into basic like slum accommodation. I'm a business, what am I going to invest in? What do the rich want? Because they've got so much money, more and more money. It's growing, it's growing. What do the rich want? So what you see is increasingly this split in industry, which is industry stops producing for the middle class. It starts producing just like bare bones essentials for the poor, and it increasingly focuses on luxury industries. So I think you're seeing this, right? You're seeing this. I live in London. We're here in London now. You see this you see this literally in the housing stock. So I grew up in Ilford in East London. It was a poor area I grew up, but it was like lower middle class, upper working class families. If you go there now, those small terraced houses, they've been expanded up, and they're rented out by the room to, you know, recent, very, very poor recent migrants. And what that is, you know, we're no longer producing middle class housing because there's not middle class. This is the thing, inequality means no middle class, so it's bare bones essentials. But obviously now I live closer to central London. If you live in and around central, what people always complain is there's only luxury housing being built. And, you know, that's an obvious consequence of this wealth inequality, which is that capitalism will adjust. If the middle class has no money and the rich have all the money, we're going to stop producing middle class cars, we're going to stop producing middle class housing, we're going to try and transition that to the rich. And I've got a lot of friends who are dentists, I've got friends who are doctors, and the ones who make the most money, they don't fix teeth for middle class people, they do plastic surgery and cosmetic stuff for rich people. And that's what you would do because these guys have the money, right? So the next thing is wealth inequality leads to industry concentration. Businesses no longer really produce for the middle, they produce for the basics for the poor and like luxuries for the rich. But there's also geographic concentration, right? So when we go back and we talk again about the relatively equal society, in a relatively equal society, everyone was an owner, everyone was a worker, and everyone was a consumer. And this is nice, right? Because workers need consumers and consumers need workers, right? Like if you want to work, you need somebody who's gonna, you know, you're a cameraman. Nobody's making videos, you got no work, right? I'm making videos, I need a cameraman. It works together, right? These two things come together. But once you move to that wealth unequal society, you split, you have a big group of workers, but they don't really spend much, they're not really consumers. And you have this small group of consumers. They've got a lot of money, but there's not a lot of them. And they don't need to work, basically. This causes geographic problems, right? Because if everyone is a worker and everyone is a consumer, then whenever you have a city, you've got workers and consumers. It's like, it works really well, right? Because the workers need consumers, consumers need workers, every worker is a consumer. So basically, cities work economically. Because wherever there's people, there's people. Wherever there's workers, there's consumers. Wherever there's consumers, there's workers. But once you have this unequal economy, then the workers are not consumers and the consumers are not workers. So what that means is, if you cannot attract rich people to your city, there's no consumers in your city. And these guys own your city, right? They own the housing, they own the food, right? You need food, you need energy, right? Well, these guys got the food, they got the energy. What are you offering? You need to offer something. So if you live in, we talk about parts of the north, which historically were big centres of industry, I could keep listing lots and lots of places, places like Newcastle, places like Glasgow, places like Wigan. Nothing wrong with these places, but places that these people have been living there for hundreds of years and they used to be like centres of industry. They're struggling now because there's no rich people there. And then you have workers without consumers. And if you have workers without consumers, then there's no jobs. So what do those consumers have to do? They have to go to where the rich people are. And we've spoken about this in other videos. I think there's a bit of a misconception in modern economics that what we're having is a big city, small city split. But it's actually not that. It's a rich city, poor city split. I studied in Oxford for 2 years. It's not a big city, very expensive. Places like Glasgow, places like Newcastle, much bigger, much cheaper. Cambridge is also expensive. If you go to the places where rich people go on holiday, phenomenally expensive. Any popular holiday destination for the rich is unbelievably expensive. If you go to the place where they study, like Oxford, it's very, very expensive. So basically, geographically, the poor people have to move. You have to move. You have to go to where the rich people are. But the problem you have is, when you have a very unequal economy, if it's 90%, 10%, well, there's 9 poor people for every rich people. If it's 99-1, there's 99 poor people for every rich person, right? And also, rich people, they tend to like the same things. They tend to want to live in the same places. They tend to want to study in the same places. They tend to want to go on holiday in the same places. They're kind of like a community, right? Rich people, they don't spend a lot of time in Wigan. They don't spend a lot of time in Newcastle. They don't spend a lot of time in Glasgow. They don't spend a lot of time in Blackpool. They just don't spend time in these places. And then you got to leave, because economically, most people are now workers but not consumers. So you got to move. So then you get these big floods. You get these big floods of people from the north of England to places like the southeast. But it's not at all UK specific. You see really, really similar things happening in the US, where places like the Rust Belt, people are leaving, they're being moved, they have to move to the coasts. You see Southern Europe, these things are happening. Spain and Italy, people are leaving, people are going to the industrial cities of Germany. You look at China, same things happening. Same things happening in China, same things happening in India. These historical places where people have lived for hundreds or maybe even thousands of years, they don't work in a very unequal society anymore. So people have to leave, The problem you have then is, they have to go to where the rich people are. There's not a lot of rich people. So those places become very overcrowded. So you get this flood of people, and then you then create a sort of a two-world world where there's either places where there's no rich people and no jobs, or places where there are rich people. Poor people are having to flood there. They're becoming extremely dense, extremely overcrowded, sometimes dirty, sometimes polluted, but most obviously, because everyone has to live there, really, really expensive. Most obviously really, really expensive rents. So you force these people who really, really need work, can't afford a house, to live in cities with rich people where rents are expensive and they can't afford the rent. So it's kind of disaster on disaster on disaster, isn't it? And this is the kind of set of mechanics which I sort of started to recognise when I was a trader. The next video I'm going to talk about why economists never talk about this, because I didn't learn these ideas from university. So for people who don't know, I did an undergrad at London School of Economics, 3 years. I did a master at Oxford for 2 years. So I've studied economics at universities for a long time. These ideas were never taught to me at university. I learned these as a trader. We're going to cover in the next video. But before I finish this video, I just want to add one other thing, which is going back to transfer payments. In the equal society, they go around, like in a circle. In the unequal society, transfer payments go one way. The people who don't own assets are paying money to people who own assets. The people who have the assets then use that money to buy the rest of the assets, which means next year the people who don't own assets have to pay more. Once you understand this, you can see that there's a worryingly accelerating nature to inequality, which is the bigger inequality is, the higher the amount of transfer payments made from the poor to the rich, which means the higher the rate at which the rich dispossess the poor, which means the higher the rate of transfer payments. So this is, and probably the thing which sort of caught me the most and worried me the most about this, mathematically, this is not self-containing. This is this thing that spirals out of control, and once it becomes, and I think this is why, if you look throughout history, you'll see that in most of history, inequality is very high. Okay, so that's it. Quite a big one, second video on the course, but I think it's really important. Because it was quite long, I'll quickly run down the main points, which is when inequality is very high, there's a high level of financial insecurity, there's a high level of transfer payments from the poor to the rich, there's not a lot of spending, a lot of poor people trying to work for a small amount of rich people who have productive capital and don't need workers. Wages are low. Number one, wages are low. The rich have enormous amount of passive income, way more than they can spend. They want to invest it, but there's no investment because there's not a lot of spending. They're trying to buy assets. Asset prices are high. Wages are low. One, asset prices are high. Two, industries tend to concentrate in whatever the rich people want, but people are also forced to concentrate wherever the rich people want. So poor people are forced to flood to their cities. Places where the rich are not living become very economically deprived. Places where the rich are living become extremely expensive. Rents become high. And because the poor are paying lots of money to the rich, inequality tends to increase and the situation gets worse year after year. Okay, that's number two. This is one of the more depressing videos on the channel, I suppose, but it's really important to understand it. And, you know, I made a lot of money betting on these things. I think it's what's happening. It's helped me to make the really good predictions we've made on the channel. Next video, we'll cover why economists never talk about it if it's so important. And we'll keep building up more and more videos to build a really comprehensive course of how inequality affects the economy. And that's it, video done.